Hey, friends. Miss P back here. We are reading chapter 5 of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Chapter 5 is called I Play Pinochle with a Horse. Let's get into it. I had weird dreams full of barnyard animals. Most of them wanted to kill me, the rest wanted food. I must have woken up several times, but what I heard and saw made no sense, so I just passed out again. I remember lying in a soft bed, being spoon-fed. Wow. Spoon fed. Something that tasted like buttered popcorn, only it was pudding. The girl with curly blonde hair hovered over me, smirking as she scraped drips off my chin with the spoon. Sorry. When she saw me open my eyes, she asked, "What will happen at the summer solstice?" I managed to croak, "What?" She looked around as if afraid someone would overhear. "What's going on?" "What was stolen? We've only got a few weeks." "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "I don't." Somebody knocked on the door, and with the girl quickly filled my mouth with pudding. The next time I woke up, the girl was gone. A husky blonde dude, like a surfer, stood in the corner of the bedroom, keeping watch over me. He had blue eyes, at least a dozen of them, on his cheeks, his forehead, the back of his hands. When I finally came around for good, there was nothing weird about my surroundings, except they were nicer than what I was used to. I was sitting in a desk chair on a huge on a huge porch, gazing across the meadow at the green hills in the distance. The breeze smelled like strawberries. There was a blanket over my legs and a pillow behind my neck. That was great, but my mouth felt like a scorpion had been using it for a nest. My tongue was dry and nasty, and one of my teeth hurt. On the table next to me was a tall glass. It looked like iced apple juice with a green straw and a paper parasol stuck through a maraschino cherry. My hand was so weak I almost dropped the glass once I got my fingers around it. "Careful," a familiar voice said. Grover was leaning against the porch railing, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Under one arm, he cradled a shoebox. He was wearing blue jeans, Converse high tops, and a bright orange t-shirt that said Camp Half-Blood. Just plain old Grover. Grover, not the goat boy. So maybe I'd had a nightmare, and maybe my mom was okay, and we were still on vacation, and we'd stopped here in this big house for some reason, and "You saved my life," Grover said. Well, the least I could do. I went back to the hill and thought you might want this." He reverently placed the shoebox in my lap. Inside was a black and white bull's horn, the base jagged from being broken off, the tip splattered with dried blood. It hadn't been a nightmare. "The Minotaur," I said. Percy, it isn't a good idea. That's what they call him in the Greek myths, isn't it?" I demanded. "The Minotaur, half man, half bull?" Grover shifted uncomfortably. "You've been out for 2 days. How much do you remember?" "My mom, is she really?" He looked down. I stared across the meadow, and there were groves of trees and a winding stream, acres of strawberries spread under the blue sky. The valley was surrounded by rolling hills, and the tallest one directly in front of us was the one with a huge pine tree on top. Even that looked beautiful in the sunlight. My mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look this beautiful. "I'm sorry," Grover sniffled. "I'm a failure. I'm the worst satyr in the world." He moaned, stomping his foot so hard it came off. The Converse high top came off. The inside was filled with styrofoam except for a hoof-shaped hole. "A Styx? Oh, Styx," he mumbled. Thunder rolled across the clear sky. He struggled to get his hoof back into the fake foot. I thought, well, that settles it. Grover was a satyr. I was ready to bet that if I shaved his curly brown hair, I'd find tiny horns on his head, but was too miserable to care that satyrs existed, or even minotaurs. All that meant was my mom had really been squeezed into nothingness, dissolved into yellow light, and I was alone, an orphan. I would have to live with Smelly Gabe? No, that would never happen. I would live on the streets first. I would pretend I was 17 and join the army. I'd do something. Grover was sniffling. The poor kid, poor goat, poor satyr, whatever. He looked as if he expected to be hit. I said it wasn't your fault. Yes, it was. I was supposed to protect you. Did my mother ask you to protect me? No, but that's my job. I'm a keeper, or at least I was. But why? I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision swimming. Don't strain yourself, Grover said. Here. He helped me hold the glass and put the straw to my lips. I recoiled at the taste because I was expecting apple juice. It wasn't that at all. It was chocolate chip cookies. Liquid cookies. And not just any cookies, my mom's homemade blue chocolate chip cookies, buttery and hot, with the chips still melting. Drinking it, my whole body felt warm and good and full of energy. My grief didn't go away, but I felt as if my mom had just brushed her hand against my cheek, given me a cookie the way she used to when I was small, and told me that everything was going to be okay. Before I knew it, I drained the glass. I stared into it. Sure, I had a warm drink, but the ice cubes hadn't even melted. Was it good? Grover asked. I nodded. What did it taste like? He sounded so wistful. I felt guilty. Sorry, I said. I should have let you taste it. His eyes got wide. No, that's not what I meant. I just wondered. Chocolate chip cookies, I said. My mom's. Homemade. He sighed. And how do you feel? Like I could throw Nancy Boba Fett 100 yards. That's good, he said. That's good. I don't think you could risk drinking any more of that stuff. What do you mean? He took the empty glass from me, took the empty glass from me gingerly, as if it were dynamite, and set it back on the table. Come on, Chiron and Mr. D are waiting. The porch wrapped all the way around the farmhouse. My legs felt wobbly trying to walk that far. Grover offered to carry the minotaur horn, but I held on to it. I'd paid for that souvenir the hard way. I wasn't going to let it go. As we came around the opposite end of the house, I caught my breath. We we must have been on the north shore of Long Island because this side of the house, the valley marched all the way up to the water, which glistened about a mile in the distance. Between here and there, I simply couldn't process everything I was seeing. The landscape was dotted with buildings that looked like an ancient Greek architecture, an open air pavilion, an amphitheater, a circular arena. Guys, it just scared me. Except that they all looked brand new. Their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. And in a nearby sand pit, a dozen high school aged kids and satyrs played volleyball. Canoes glided across the small lake. Kids in bright orange t shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around in a cluster of Excuse me, sorry, I told you it was late. In bright orange t shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled in the woods. Some shot targets at an archery range. Others rode horses down a wooden trail. And unless I was hallucinating, some of those horses had wings. I know, I can't believe it either, Kaiser. Down at the end of the porch, two men sat across from each other at a card table. The blonde haired girl, who spoon fed me popcorn flavored pudding, was leaning on the porch rail next to them. The man facing me was small, but porky. He had a big red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair, so black it was almost purple. He looked like those paintings of baby angels. What do you call them? Hubbubs? No, cherubs. That's it. He looked like a cherub who turned middle aged in a trailer park. He wore a tiger pattern Hawaiian shirt, and would have fit right in at one of Gabe's poker parties. Except I got the feeling this guy could have outgambled even my stepfather. That's Mr. D, Grover muttered to me. He's the camp director. Be polite. The girl, that's Annabeth Chase. She's just a camper, but she's been here longer than just about anybody. And you already know Chiron. He pointed at the guy whose back was to me. First, I realized he was sitting. First, I realized he was sitting in the wheelchair, and then I recognized the tweed jacket, thinning brown hair, and the scraggly beard. Mr. Bruner? I cried. The Latin teacher turned and smiled at me. His eyes had a mischievous glint, and they sometimes got in class when he pulled a pop quiz, and all the multiple choice answers were B. P.S. Miss Patrick will never do that. Oh my gosh, Kaiser hit me in the face. Okay. Oh, good, Percy. Now we have 4 people for Pinochle. He offered me a chair to the right of Mr. D, who looked at me with bloodshot eyes and a heavy sigh. Oh, I suppose I must say it. Welcome to Camp Half Blood. There, now, don't expect me to be glad to see you. Thanks. I scooted a little farther away from him because if there was one thing I had learned from living with Gabe, it was how to tell when an adult had been hitting the happy juice. If Mr. D was a stranger to alcohol, I was a satyr. Annabeth, Mr. Bruner called to the blonde girl. She came forward and Mr. Bruner introduced us. This lady nursed you back to health, Percy. Annabeth, my dear, why don't you go check on Percy's bunk? We'll be putting him in the cabin 11 for now. Annabeth said, sure, Chiron. She was probably my age, maybe a couple of inches taller and a whole lot more athletic looking. Her deep tan and curly blonde hair, she was almost exactly what I thought a stereotypical California girl would look like, except her eyes ruined the image. They were startling gray, like storm clouds. Pretty, but intimidating too, as if she were analyzing the best way to take me down in a fight. She glanced at the minotaur horn in my hands, then back at me. I imagine she's going to say, you killed a minotaur, or, oh wow, you're awesome, or something like that. Instead, she said, you drool when you sleep. Then she sprinted down the lawn, her blonde hair flying behind her. So, anxious to change the subject. You, work here, Mr. Bruner? Not Mr. Bruner, the ex-Mr. Bruner said. I'm afraid that was a pseudonym. You can call me Chiron. Okay, totally confused. I looked at the director and Mr. D, does that stand for something? Mr. D stopped shuffling the cards and he looked at me like I just belched loudly. Young man. Sorry. Okay. Young man, names are powerful things. You don't just go around using them for no reason. Oh, right. Sorry. I must say, Percy, Chiron Bruner broke in, I'm glad to see you alive. It's been a long time since I've made a house call to a potential camper. I'd hate to think that I would have wasted my time. House call? My year at ENC Academy to instruct you. We have the satyrs at most schools, of course, keeping a lookout, but Grover alerted me as soon as he met you. He sensed you were something special, so I decided to come upstate. I convinced the other Latin teacher to take a leave of absence. I tried to remember the beginning of the school year, but it seems so long ago. But I did have a fuzzy memory of there being another Latin teacher at my first week at Yancey. Then, without explanation, he had disappeared and Mr. Bruner had taken the class. You came to Yancey just to teach me? Chiron nodded. Honestly, I wasn't sure about you at first. We contacted your mother, let her know we were keeping an eye on you in case you were ready for Camp Half-Blood. But you still had so much to learn. Nevertheless, you made it here alive, and that's always the first test. Grover, Mr. D said impatiently, are you playing or not? Yes, sir. Grover trembled as he took the 4th chair, though I didn't know why he should be so afraid of a pudgy little man in a tiger print Hawaiian shirt. Do you know how to play pinochle? Mr. D eyed me suspiciously. I'm afraid not, I said. I'm afraid not, sir, he said. Sir, I repeated. I was likening the camp director less and less. Well, he told me, it is, along with gladiator fighting style and Pac-Man, one of the greatest games ever invented by humans. I would expect all civilized young men to know the rules. But I'm sure the boy can learn, Chiron said. Please, I said, what is this place? What am I doing here? Mr. Bruner, Chiron, why would you go to Yancey Academy just to teach me? Mr. D snorted. I asked the same question. The camp director dealt the cards. Grover flinched every time one landed in his pile. Chiron smiled at me sympathetically, the way he used to in Latin class, as if to let me know that no matter what my average was, I was his star student. He expected me to have the right answer. Percy said, did your mother tell you anything? Or tell you nothing, I'm sorry. She said, I remembered her sad eyes looking out of the sea. She told me she was afraid to send me here, even though my father had wanted her to. She said that once I was here, I probably wouldn't leave, and she wanted to keep me close to her. Typical, said Mr. D. That's how they usually get killed. Young man, are you bidding or not? What? He explained impatiently how to bid in pinochle, so I did. I'm afraid there's too much to tell, Chiron said. I'm afraid your usual orientation film won't be sufficient. Orientation film? I asked. No, Chiron decided. Well, Percy, you know your friend Grover is a satyr. You know, he pointed at the horn in the shoebox, that you have killed the Minotaur. No small feat either, lad. What you may not know is that the great powers are at work in your life. Gods, the forces you call the Greek gods, are very much alive. I stared at the others around the table and waited for somebody to yell, "Not!" But all I got was Mr. D yelling, "Oh, a royal marriage! Trick, trick!" he cackled as he tallied up his points. Mr. D, Grover asked him timidly, "If you're not going to eat it, could I have your Diet Coke can?" All right. Grover bit a huge shard out of the empty aluminum can and chewed it mournfully. Wait, I told Chiron, you're telling me there's such a thing as God? Well, now, Chiron said, God, capital G, God. That's a different matter altogether. We shan't deal with the metaphysical. Metaphysical, but you were just talking about, gods, plural, as in great beings that control the forces of nature and human endeavors, the immortal gods of Olympus. That's the smaller matter. Smaller? Yes, quite. The gods we discussed in your Latin class. Zeus, I said. Hera, Apollo, you mean them? And there it was again, the distant thunder on a cloudless day. Young man, Mr. D said Mr. D, I would be less casual about throwing those names around if I were you. But they're stories, I said. They're myths to explain lightning and the seasons and stuff. Which myth was that? Persephone? Yeah. Okay. They're what people believed in before there was science. Science, Mr. D scoffed. And tell me, Perseus Jackson, I flinched when he said my real name, which I never told anybody. What will people think of your science 2,000 years from now? Mr. D continued. Will they call it primitive mumbo jumbo? Oh, that's what. I love mortals. They have absolutely no sense of perspective. They think they've come so far. And have they, Chiron? Look at this boy and tell me. I wasn't liking Mr. D much, but there was something about the way he called me mortal, as if he wasn't. Um, it was enough to put a lump in my throat to suggest why Grover was doodly minding his cards, chewing his soda can, and keeping his mouth shut. Percy, Chiron said, you may choose to believe or not, but the fact is that immortal means immortal. Can you imagine that for a moment? Never dying, never fading, existing just as you are for all time? I was about to answer off the top of my head, and that sounded like a pretty good deal, but the tone of Chiron's voice made me hesitate. You mean whether people believed in you or not? I said. Exactly, Chiron agreed. If you were a god, how would you like being called a myth or an old story explaining lightning? What if I told you, Perseus Jackson, that someday people would call you a myth? That you were just created to explain how little boys can get over losing their mothers? My heart pounded. He was trying to make me angry for some reason, but I wasn't going to let him. I said, I wouldn't like it, but I don't believe in gods. Oh, you better, Mr. D mumbled. Muttered. Sorry, I said the wrong word 3 times. Before one of them incinerates you. Grover said, please, sir, he's just lost his mother. He's in shock. A lucky thing, too, Mr. D grumbled, playing a card. Bad enough I'm confined to this miserable job working with boys who don't even believe. He waved his hand and a goblet appeared on the side of the table, as if sunlight had bent momentarily and woven the air into glass. The goblet filled itself with red wine. My jaw dropped, but Chiron hardly looked up. Mr. D, he warned, your restrictions. Mr. D looked at the wine and feigned surprise. Dear me! He looked at the sky and yelled, old habits, sorry. More thunder. Mr. D waved his hand again, and the wine glass changed into a fresh can of Diet Coke. He sighed unhappily and popped the top of the soda and went back to his card game. Chiron winked at me. Mr. D offended his father a while back and took a fancy wood nymph who had been declared off I'm sorry, I read that really wrong. Mr. D offended his father a while back, took fancy, took a fancy to a wood nymph who had been declared off limits. A wood nymph? I repeated, staring directly at the Diet Coke can like it was from outer space. Yes, Mr. D confessed. Father loves to punish me. First time, prohibition. Ghastly. Absolutely horrid 10 years. The second time, well, she was really pretty and I couldn't stay away. The second time, he sent me here, Half Blood Hill. Summer camp for brats like you. Be a better influence on me. Work with the youth rather than tearing them down. Ha! Absolutely unfair. Unfair. Mr. D sounded about 6 years old, like a little kid pouting. And I stammered, your father is De Immortalis, Chiron. Mr. D said, I thought you taught this boy his basics. My father is Zeus, of course. I ran through D names from Greek mythology. Wine, skin of a tiger, the satyrs that all seemed to work here, the way Grover cringed as Mr. D was were his master. You're Dionysus, I said, the god of wine. Mr. D rolled his eyes. Do they say, what do they say these days, Grover? Do children say, well, duh? Yes, Mr. D. Then, well, duh, Percy Jackson. Did you think I was Aphrodite, perhaps? You're a god. Yes, child, a god. You? He turned to look at me straight on, and I saw a kind of purplish fire in his eyes, a hint that his whiny, plump little man was only showing me the tiniest bit of his true nature. I saw visions of grapevines choking unbelievers to death, drunken warriors insane with battle lust, sailors screaming as their heads turned to flippers, their faces elongated into dolphin snouts. I knew that if I pushed him, Mr. D would show me worse things. He would plant a disease in my brain that would leave me wearing a straitjacket in a rubber room for the rest of my life. Would you like to test me, child? He said quietly. No, 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 sir. A fire died a little, and he turned back to his card game. I believe I win. Not quite, Mr. D, Chiron said. He sat down as straight, tallied the points, and said, the game goes to me. I thought Mr. D was going to vaporize Chiron right there out of his wheelchair, but he just sighed through his nose, as if he were used to being beat by the Latin teacher. He got up, and Grover rose too. I'm tired, Mr. D said. I believe I'll take a nap before the sing-along tonight. But first, Grover, we need to talk again about your less than perfect performance on this assignment. Grover's face beaded with sweat. Yes, sir. Mr. D turned to me. Cabin 11, Percy Jackson, and mind your manners. He swept into the farmhouse, and Grover following miserably. Will Grover be okay? I asked Chiron. Chiron nodded, though he looked a bit troubled. Old Dionysus really isn't really mad. He hates his job. He's been grounded, I guess you could say, and he can't stand waiting for another century before he's allowed to go back to Olympus. Mount Olympus, I said. You're telling me there really is a palace there? Well, now there's Mount Olympus in Greece, and then there's the home of the gods, the convergent point of their powers, to which indeed used to be on Mount Olympus. It's still called Mount Olympus out of respect of the old ways, but the palace moves, Percy, just as the gods do. You mean the Greek gods are here, like in America? Well, certainly. The gods move with the heart of the West. The what? Come now, Percy, what do you call Western civilization? Do you think it's just an abstract concept? No, it's a living force, a collective consciousness that has burned bright for thousands of years. The gods are a part of it. You might even say they're the source of it, or at least they are tied so tightly to it that they couldn't possibly fade. Not unless all of Western civilization were obliterated. The fire started in Greece. Then, as you well know, sorry, or as I hope you would know since you passed my course, the heart of the fire moved to Rome, and so did the gods, on different names perhaps. Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, and so on. But the same force and the same gods. And then they died? Died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved to Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was the brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England, and all you people do is look at architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 300 years, you can see them in paintings and statues and most important buildings. And yes, Percy, of course, they are now in your United States. Look at your symbol, the eagle of Zeus. Look at the statue of Prometheus in the Rockefeller Center, the Greek facades of your government buildings in Washington. I defy you to find any American city where the Olympians are not prominently displayed in multiple places. Like it or not, and believe me, plenty of people were not very fond of Rome either. America is now the heart of the flame. It was the great power of the West, and so Olympus is here, and we are here. It was all too much, especially the fact that I seemed to be included in Chiron's we, as if I were a part of some club. Who are you, Chiron? Who am I? Chiron smiled. He shifted his weight as if he were going to get out of his wheelchair, but I knew that was impossible. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Who are you? He mused. Well, that's the question we all want answered, isn't it? But for now, we should get you to cabin 11. There will be new friends to meet and plenty of time for lessons tomorrow. Besides, there will be s'mores at the campfire tonight, and I simply adore chocolate. And then he did rise from his wheelchair, but there was something odd about the way he did. His blanket fell away from his legs, but his legs didn't move. His waist kept getting longer, rising above his belt. At first, he thought he was wearing a very long white velvet underwear, but as he kept rising out of the chair, taller than any man, I realized that that velvet underwear wasn't underwear. It was the front of an animal, muscle and sinew under coarse white fur. And the wheelchair wasn't a chair. It was some kind of container, an enormous box on wheels. It must have been magic because there's no way it could have held him. A leg came out, long and knobby-kneed, and a huge polished hoof, and then another front leg, and then hindquarters, and then the box was empty. Nothing but a metal shell with a couple of fake human legs attached. I stared at the horse who had just sprung out of the wheelchair, a huge white stallion. But where its neck should be was the upper body of my Latin teacher, smoothly grafted to the horse's trunk. What a relief, the centaur said. I've been cooped up in there so long, my fetlocks had fallen asleep. Come now, Percy Jackson. Let's meet the other campers.